Hello and welcome, and this is Peter. The first thing I'd like to say, gentlemen, is thank you very much for coming along and listening to this audio today. I really appreciate your time and attention, so thank you very much for coming along. First off, the little plug for CTL. Please don't forget, gentlemen, that CTL is free and open source. You can get it off my website. If you're using name brand ETL tools like Informatica and DataStage, you can still use CTL for your development effort, and that will cut your development effort in about half. If you decide to migrate from wherever you are across to CTL, your ongoing support and maintenance for your ETL software will be between 60 and 80% less than what you're spending today on the likes of DataStage and Informatica. And I can say that with some credibility. Our current amount of effort for implementing a Type 2 dimension is about 2 hours from start to production, and a fact table is about 4 work hours start to production. Okay? So compare your ETL development times with 2 hours for a dimension table and 4 hours for a fact table from I need this to running in production, because those are the best numbers we're getting currently. Okay? And we have resellers who can do that sort of work for you. So that's a little plug for CTL. It's free, it's open source, it's my baby, it's my brainchild. I think it's worthwhile. I've been using versions of it for 25 years. I think you should use it too. Okay? So now, on to the topic of this audio, and that is the history of BI models. I'm a student of history, gentlemen, and I think when you go over and you look at the history of something, you understand how it is it came to be where you are today, and looking at the, let's say, trajectory of where we used to be to where we are today, you get a better view of where we're going in the future. All right? So I think it's interesting and important to hear a little bit about the history of BI models, because people are putting forward different ways of developing models today. Our friends at Teradata are still in third normal form world. There's Data Vault 2.0 promoted by Dan Lindstedt and colleagues, and there's dimensional modeling promoted by Ralph Kimball and colleagues, one of which would be me. And people have arguments like it's a religious debate. And we had this religious debate in the 90s. Apparently the religious debate hasn't gone away, and I said a lot about this in the 90s, so I'll have my say again. And for those who listen, you listen, and for those who don't listen, then you don't listen. Okay? It's like that. One thing I will add, I checked out how these audios are playing on my phone the other day, and they played really well. I sent myself the email. I just clicked on the link on the email of go to blog. I went to my phone. I played it on the phone, and it played perfectly. So these audios played really well just on your phone. So you can play them anywhere. Your phone is everywhere, right? So you can play these things anywhere now. It's quite cool. So let's go back. Let's go back to early 1980s. All right, this is when this thing started. This business intelligence thing really started in the early 1980s. There was a company called IRI, and they had a product called IRI Express, which was a cube-based product, and the consumer packaged goods companies were using it to try and understand the effectiveness of their marketing dollar spends. And of course, in the early 80s, consumer packaged goods companies were spending a lot of money on advertising, and they're trying to figure out, is this the best way to spend our advertising money? Along comes a group of guys, David Liddell, Don Manserio, and one young Ralph Kimball, and they started a new company, and that new company was called Metaphor Computer Systems. And they all came out of Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center. And they had a vision of being able to empower business analysts, not technical people, to be able to analyze their marketing dollar spends in the consumer packaged goods industry to more effectively spend their marketing dollars. And because so much money was being spent on marketing dollars, they figured they could sell a fairly reasonably priced solution to do that. Right? That's kind of the beginning point we want to take. So Ralph Kimball in 1982 had to figure out, well, this data that we're going to store in a database, how are we going to store it? Are we going to copy IRI Express and store it in a cube? Or are we going to look into these newfangled relational database thingies? Remember, 1982, relational databases were pretty much newfangled thingies back then. Now remember, they had to run the database on a Motorola 68000. They decided to go with the Motorola chip rather than the Intel chip. And they wrote a version of Unix and used a version of Unix and upgraded it for both the GUI and the database servers and the other servers. They used Unix-based systems. And they could put 4 megs of memory into the database server. That was kind of the size that they were looking at. So they had a Motorola 68000 chip running at 1 megahertz as they did in 1982, and they had 4 megs of memory, and they had to put a database on there that 8 people could query. So there was a choice. Do we use a cube database or a relational database? Now Ralph chose a relational database. Now with the relational database at the time, then the problem was, how do we present this data such that it's easy enough to query for people who are not database experts? And Ralph decided to implement a model that looked like a cube and presented like a cube. And the early metaphor tools, indeed, one of the tools, the reporter tool, could only read something if it was a cube. It had to be a cube. It had to be a star schema, right? The query tool could query other things, but the reporter tool could only query a dimensional model. And they were building an interface for business people, people who were familiar with spreadsheets, because by 1982 Lotus 123 was starting to be used, and some people were starting to be familiar with spreadsheets and things like that. And the idea was to be able to empower the business users to do their own analysis and not rely on asking the IT shop to write reports for them, which they would then rekey into this new thing, the Lotus 123 spreadsheet. So some people have said, well, the star scheme is lossy. Well, it was intended to be lossy. The dimensional models, the whole philosophy of the dimensional models back in the 80s when Ralph started out was, everything is so expensive, we have to take just the very most important data, important meaning the data that could be best be used to increase the sustainable long-term profitability of a consumer packaged goods company. That data, the really important stuff, we need to feed that into the metaphor database and let business analysts access it. And that model was the star schema, and it works really well. Now, to give you an idea of how well it worked, when I did my very first data warehouse project in 1991, coming up on 30 years next month, gentlemen. Next month will be my 30th anniversary of my very first BI project. I went to lunch with the guy who was going to be my customer liaison for the project. I went to lunch. We're down at a coffee shop downstairs in the building, and on the back of a napkin, and I literally mean on the napkin that we had at lunch, he drew a picture of how he wanted to be able to analyze his data, telling me, the IBM systems engineer, how he wanted to be able to analyze data. And what he drew was fundamentally an idea that would be supported by a cube or a dimensional model. That's what he drew. Of course, I had no idea what he meant because I was a third normal form person. We'd all been taught to develop relational databases in third normal form. And I literally, gentlemen, I took this napkin around to all the DB2 experts at IBM and said, this is what my customer has drawn. What do you think? How do we do this? And they all went, I don't know, that looks completely foreign to me. I don't understand that at all, right? And that's kind of where we started. So I built a third normal form database which failed on performance, and then I invented multi-level summary tables from June 1991 through to September 1991. And multi-level summary tables worked really well. We took queries taking 1,000 CPU seconds and brought them down to between 1 and 3 seconds. It was fantastic. And then at the end of the year, 1991, that same guy who drew that picture on that napkin took me out to lunch, and I asked him the question at Doyle's. Really, like, gentlemen, Doyle's in Sydney is one of the best restaurants. I have myself personally only ever eaten in his Sydney restaurant once, this one time, because it's pretty expensive. And so this gentleman took me to Doyle's, and I had a nice lunch. And I was saying, how did you manage to cost justify what it is we're selling you? Because we're interested, because you're doing stuff that we don't know about. We were IBM, and we had other insurance customers, so we were excluded from any conversations that might even present the possibility of a perception of conflict of interest. So there was a lot of meetings I was actually asked to leave, go stand outside the door while they talked. And he said to me, it was $300,000 in Metaphor software and hardware, plus the ongoing CPU costs, etc., for the development machine. So anyhow, he said they've already made back their $300,000, and they're very thankful for all the hard work that I did, and they look forward to making a great deal more money. And I asked him, well, how did they do that? And he said, I can't tell you because you work for IBM and you have other insurance customers. So we're not going to tell you what it is that we're doing. We're going to ask you to do work for us. You do that work for us, and we go on and we do our side of it. We cannot create the perception of conflict of interest. So that was fine. And so I didn't know what they were doing, and I didn't find out what they were doing until after I resigned from IBM in mid-1994. But in the manuals for Meta5, there were these things called dimensional models and star schemas, and they looked really far out, and we had no way of understanding them. We couldn't do them. But I was now that we had an installed account in Australia, I was talking to the guys from Metaphor on the email, and they were singing the praises of star schemas and all the rest of it, and telling me that I should learn how to do that. So in September 1993 was actually a pivotal moment in my BI career. What happened was I went to the Worldwide Users Conference for Meta5, the last one that ever happened, in September 1993, and I met with all the big Metaphor customers, Coca-Cola, Walgreens, Better Homes and Gardens, all these kind of guys who were using Meta5. I went and talked to them, I went to their sessions, I listened to them, and I was having lunch one time with the head of the Worldwide User Group, Meta5 User Group, or Metaphor User Group as it was, and he was from Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola were the biggest users in the world of Meta5, and he said to the people at the table, it was a group of people, about 15, 20 of us at this big table inside this big hotel. The user conference was in a big hotel, and I'd managed to snaggle a seat at this table for lunch. And he said that he had a guy called Bill Inman giving the keynote speech, and he said, please make sure that everyone from your organizations is there for the keynote speech, because this is going to be really special. I'm like, okay. So I went to obviously I'm going to go to the keynote speech, and this guy got up and started talking. I'd never heard of him before, and I had my customer sitting next to me, a guy called Cole, and I said to Cole, do you understand anything this guy's saying? And he goes, no, he's making no sense to me. And we look around behind us, because we were in the front row, we look around behind us, and everybody else is taking notes furiously. And I'm like, everyone else is taking notes, so I'm going to take notes. I said, I don't know what I'm taking notes about, but I'm going to take notes. He goes, okay. So Bill did his 1 hour keynote presentation, And I went up to introduce myself because I'd never heard of him, and I didn't understand anything that he said during that 1 hour presentation. And I introduced myself, my name's Peter, I'm from IBM Australia. And he's like, wow, that's like there's an Australian in the audience. I'm really impressed. I said, well, we're here to learn more. He said, everyone here thinks that you know what you're talking about. I have no clue what you said. And I said to him, have you written any books? Can I buy some books of yours? Or have you written books or papers? How do I find out about what you just talked about? He said, yes, of course I've written some books. And he told me they were available through Addison Wesley, but not published in Australia. So I had to get some guys from IBM to buy the books for me and ship them over to our Sydney office, right? And I read Bill's books. So for those of you who think that there's always been this big division between dimensional models and what Bill talked about, and there's something of a conflict between Ralph and Bill Kimball, please just remember that Coca-Cola, largest implementer of dimensional models in the world, largest user of metaphor in the world, invited Bill Inman to come and do the keynote speech for the 1993 Metaphor Worldwide Users Conference. So there was never, ever any dispute between those two. Okay? So why was there no dispute when other people have made up a dispute? The reason that there appears to be a dispute to those people who don't know what it is that they're talking about is Ralph Kimball is an engineer and all that goes with that. Metaphor had a specific vision, the vision being to empower business analysts in consumer packaged goods companies to analyze their advertising dollar spend to improve the effectiveness of their advertising dollar spend. That's what Metaphor was doing, and they were very successful at that. To people who sold stuff and advertised in order to sell that stuff, they were everywhere. They were in Coca-Cola, and Procter & Gamble was one of their biggest customers. And legend has it, it was the CEO of Procter & Gamble that called the CEO of IBM and got the ball moving on IBM buying Metaphor. Legend has it. I don't know if that actually happened, but it's a good legend if it didn't. So they had a very, very, very specific target audience. You manufacture products and you sell products through advertising, through a third party. We're the guys who are going to help you figure out the best way to spend your advertising money. That was their space, and they were very good at it. And because the margins were astronomical because of the amount of money involved. They were all about targeting the marketing dollar spend to be more effective. To do that, there's only a certain amount of information within an organization that's of value in aiming at that problem. So it was a very, very, very sharp arrow aimed at a very difficult problem in very large companies that Metaphor was building. That's what they were building. And back in the day, you could buy 8 Metaphor workstations. You couldn't buy 7, you couldn't buy 9, you bought 8 in your initial configuration. That's how it worked. So Bill Inman, on the other hand, is not an engineer. Bill Inman is a theoretician. He's a thinker. He's someone who doesn't solve specific problems. He solves a broad range of problems. He solves theoretical problems. Not problems that have specific application today, but problems that if we solve them today, theoretically, there should be a benefit in the future. That's what Bill does. Okay? And he's very good at that, by the way. And so during this period in the 80s, when so many large computer systems were being developed and deployed, many on IBM mainframes, Bill came across the idea that it would make a lot of sense if we could take all this information and archive it so that when we needed to make decisions, we could look back on the information that we had. Because in a lot of cases, data was deleted relatively quickly from these large operational systems because of the cost of the disk, cost of the processing. Your operational systems slowed down as more data was put into them. Those things. So data was taken out of these operational systems and either deleted completely or archived onto tape where it was not readable. Not really. And Bill Inman was thinking about all this and thinking, if we just archived all this information, then we should be able to answer any question that arises in the future from any information we archived. And that should have value. And indeed it did, particularly in industries like life insurance. So Ralph Kimball was talking about we are working in a company that's solving a very specific problem for a very specific set of users or business people in very specific sorts of companies, and we're going to aim that very sharp arrow at that problem, and underlying that is going to be a dimensional model, a lossy dimensional model even. And Bill Inman was thinking, all this data that we're collecting in all these computer systems, it has value if we archive it. We don't know exactly what the value is because we don't know what questions are going to be asked yet, but if we archive everything, then we're going to be able to answer any question that we come up with. Doesn't matter what the question is. And yeah, it may run for a long time, but we'll still get the answer. So this is why Bill Inman was such a friend with Teradata at the time. He was saying to companies, archive everything, and Teradata was saying, we've got the machine that you want to archive things on. And so Bill Inman, when I met him in September 1993, and he said, yes, I've written a book, it's called Building the Data Warehouse, and I bought the book and I read it. Inside the book there was the idea of time variant plus stability analysis data archives. And a little while later, Bill came out to Australia and did a seminar. We took him out fishing. He caught a 50-kilogram yellowfin tuna, and that big fish story that Bill goes around telling is actually true. I was there on the boat, and I saw the fish. In fact, I took that fish home, and we got it cut up and we ate it. Took forever to eat that fish. So anyhow, Bill came out to Australia and did a seminar, and the guy who ran it was a guy called Steve Hitchman, and we sold every seat, plus there was standing room. We were selling tickets for, I think it was 3 days, no, it was a one full day, and we were selling the tickets for like $800, and some people stood for the whole day, paid $800 and stood for the whole day to hear Bill Inman speak. Now I got a seat, and Bill, by now I'd read his book, and by now I was a little bit more familiar with all this stuff, and he was talking about these archival stores and talking about the work he was doing at some of his customers. And I remember putting my hand up and saying, Bill, you're talking about archiving everything that has gone through a mainframe computer for a large company. And he goes, yes. And I say, but that's a lot of data. And he said, yes. And he said, this is an amount of data of which today we cannot conceive. And I'm like, yes. Like, remember me? I worked in finance. I worked in insurance for IBM. I knew how big these computers were. I knew how many transactions went through them. Archiving these transactions onto a separate system, like, that's a lot of data. Like, a lot of data. And he's talking about 5 to 10 years. And I'm thinking 5 to 10 years of banking transactions, airline transactions, telephone billing records, 5 to 10 years of these things. And he's saying we are talking about volumes of data of which we cannot even comprehend today. This is the future, Bill was saying in front of this large assembled group. And then my next question was, when we were going through, my next question was, but Bill, if we use this time variant plus stability analysis modeling technique, there aren't any tools that can ask questions of this. You can't query that thing with a tool. And I'll never forget, Bill said, the appropriate query tool for this data model is called a COBOL programmer. And we all laughed, but he was right. You couldn't write a query tool to query these things. And this was 1994. And we're listening to all this and we're going, there is value in building archives. Like if we could archive everything and we could answer any question that came up at a later point in time, that would be a gold mine, literally a gold mine. That would be really good. But it would be really expensive to build, and we still got to sell it in the first place before we build it in the second place. So that would be really expensive to build. And by now I had learned how to build dimensional models. And the guy who trained me was the guy that Ralph Kimball left in charge at Metaphor after he left. So the link is Ralph Kimball ran the dimensional modeling team in Metaphor, and when he left in 1989, he handed over to another guy. His name was Steve, and Steve was the guy who trained me how to build dimensional models. So I was trained one step away from Ralph Kimball, and I did Ralph's classes when he came out. So we knew and understood by 1994, we knew and understood the value of dimensional models, and we have this strange new thing called a data warehouse as an archive layer that Bill was talking about, and talking about volumes of which we can't comprehend, complexity in development like we can't comprehend, and querying ability that you can't query it, you've got to get a programmer to query it. But nevertheless, it was, and humongously expensive, but nevertheless of value, right? So we were looking at these two things, 94, 95, we were looking at these two things. Then an interesting thing happened in late 94. In late 94, IBM shut down Metaphor, and this guy Steve was kicked out of a job. And he wasn't very happy about that. I always joked that Steve was a very well-balanced person because he had a chip on both shoulders about being kicked out of IBM at that point in time. He had put his heart and soul into that business, and IBM kicked him out summarily. So Steve had a bit of a chip on his shoulders, and he went to PricewaterhouseCoopers from IBM. And at PricewaterhouseCoopers, or Pricewaterhouse as it was at the time, he became the lead guy in the Pricewaterhouse data warehousing business. And he wrote the methodology, he designed the models. For the early years, all the models had to go across his desk. And he was the guy who built, literally, he was the guy, the key guy, who provided all the intellectual property to create the Price Waterhouse business intelligence practice, data warehousing practice, which exploded and became the world's largest data warehousing practice. This was my old buddy Steve. And Steve was trying to get me to join Pricewaterhouse in Australia, and I was highly resistant to that because they were a bunch of scumbags in Australia, and I didn't really want to go and work for them. And it was well known in Australia that they were not a very nice group of guys. There was, in the area that I would go into, there was one particular guy there, a guy called Fred Balboni, who was quite famous in Australia. And later it turned out, after I left Pricewaterhouse, I found out that Fred Balboni had actually been kicked out of Pricewaterhouse Chicago and kind of banished off to Australia for, let's say, some rather unsavory things, let's say. That's how he finished up in Australia. And word got around in Australia that he was not a very nice guy, and I didn't want to go work for him. Okay. But in the end I did, and it was a mistake, and I was only there for a year. So this guy Steve was the guy who ran the PricewaterhouseCoopers data warehouse consulting practice. Created it, ran it. And his boss was a guy called Mike Schreck, who I know fairly well. So anyhow, Mike Schreck is retired now, of course. So anyhow, a fateful thing happened. In the 94 to 96 period, we would either build an archival data store or a dimensional model. And I was building dimensional models. I joined Hitachi and we promoted dimensional models, and I was the man literally who launched dimensional modeling in Australia. I was the man who introduced dimensional modeling to Australia. So we were building dimensional models. Steve, on the other hand, was building some dimensional models, some archives for BI4ALL012. Okay. And he sent me an email one day and he said, I've got a strange situation with a customer over here and I'm looking for your advice and guidance. What ideas have you got? Because I'm kind of stumped. And we exchanged emails backwards and forwards. So this was 1996. And his problem was he was doing a life insurance customer, and I'd been 5 years in life insurance, which is why he's asking me about life insurance, right? And I said to him, yeah, you have a lot of problems with dimensional models in life insurance because the policy record changes slowly. In individual fields change on the policy records, and individual fields change on the rider records, and it doesn't really suit a dimensional model very well, and it is really valuable to store all those changes. So I understand you don't know which one to go for, a dimensional model or an archive. I can understand that. So we bounced these emails backwards and forwards for a while, and I said to him after a while, I said, well, why don't you propose both? Why don't you just do both? Build an archive, the Bill Inman way, and then build a layer of dimensional models on top, the Ralph Kimball way, and that should solve all your problems. And he's like, yeah, but how much is that going to cost? And I'm saying, well, you guys are BI4ALL012. You like it when it costs a lot of money to develop something for your customers, don't you? And of course that was true. So they decided to make an experiment of this life insurance customer, build an archive and build dimensional models. And they did. And it worked really well. In the end, once they got it implemented, it worked really well. And we had the emails exchanges backwards and forwards. And he said, we tried it. Archive plus dimensional models together works really well. So we're going to go forward with that. And in BI4ALL012, that became the standard recommendation. By 1997, maybe late 97 or early 98, somewhere around there, the standard recommendation from BI4ALL012 to clients was to have an archive and have an archive a la Bill Inman and a set of dimensional models a la Ralph Kimball and sell that to the customer. That was the standard. And in 98, I joined PricewaterhouseCoopers, and that was what we were selling. That's what we were pushing. All right? So I joined PricewaterhouseCoopers in Sydney in 1998, so I know for sure and for certain that's what we were pushing because that's what we were pushing. And Steve and I, now working for the same company, were banging our heads together trying to think of how do we, the cost of doing this, gentlemen, was enormous. We were charging companies a lot of money, and we were cognizant of the fact that other companies were now starting to sell just dimensional models, and that just selling dimensional models would be significantly cheaper than what it was we were doing. Ours had more functionality, but you still had to sell the value of that functionality up front to be able to get the deal. So we were putting our heads together about how could we improve what it was that we had. And what we were trying to do was figure out how to archive data in a dimensional model because we knew we needed the dimensional model for the end user applications. We knew we needed dimensional models for users to use. That was taken for granted. But the archive, which was complex and difficult to query anyway, and fed those cubes, the archives in this time variance stability analysis form, Steve and I were thinking, if we can figure out a way to archive data properly inside a dimensional model, we can do away with this time variance plus stability analysis as a different modeling technique and have a dimensional modeling technique in the archive as well as in the user access layer. Now Steve and I banged our heads together, put our heads together on that for 5 years. 5 years? 4 years. From 97 through to 2001. Okay, from 97 through to 2001. And between us, we couldn't figure out a solution. So Steve was, as far as I was aware, next to Ralph, the best dimensional modeling guy on the planet. And if Steve and I couldn't figure out a solution, pretty much we decided it's not possible. It can't be done. And that's when, gentlemen, in February 2001, I joined Sean Kelly in the Sybase BI division for Europe, and I went to the first 3 days of the Industry Warehouse Studio training, and I saw in that training how to archive data perfectly in a dimensional model. And I was impressed, I can tell you. I was very impressed. And I said to the guy who was running the class, I asked him who invented this, and he said he did. And I said, I've been trying to figure out this problem since 1996. And he goes, yeah, I can imagine you would be. He said, if you build data warehouses like Bill Inman builds them, you would be trying to figure out that problem because you don't want to have the two modeling techniques. And I said, exactly, precisely. And he said, yeah. He said, by the way, these things will work for operational data stores as well. And I said, really? He said, yeah, the modeling technique that this gentleman had come up with would not only work for the dimensional models that were needed for the business applications, it would work for the archive layer, and it would also work for the operational data store, which was now a thing by 2001. Because we used to build operational data stores as third normal form databases. We used to build the archive layer as time variant plus stability analysis, and we used to build the analytical layers as dimensional models. So we had 3 different modeling techniques within the what Bill had by now called the corporate information factory. And because you have 3 different modeling techniques, you have cost profiles associated with those 3 different modeling techniques. So when this guy said, yeah, we looked at all the stuff that Bill did, that was all public, and it's in his books, the way we archive data supports everything that Bill's talking about, and we can use the dimensional modeling techniques inside the operational data store as long as we've got enough horsepower to get the ETL processing to run to send the data into the operational data store in the time frame that's required. So you can't do it instantly because there is some work to do. You've got to insert your dimension records, then insert your fact records, and you've got to do things in order. But if you've got 10 or 15 minutes lag, you can use dimensional modeling inside your operational data store. And I was like, wow, that's really impressive because that'll save a lot of money in development and maintenance. He goes, oh yeah. He was saying, if you implement these models, he goes, we're charging $150,000 for these models, right? But if you implement these models across your analytical applications, your warehouse archive, and your operational data store, you will save that $150,000 in a few years just in support costs. And I was like, yeah, you would. He goes, yeah, not to mention processor and disk, because you don't have duplicated data so much. You have a little bit of duplicated data in the operational data store, but of course you only keep in the operational data store your relatively current data, and so the only data that's replicated, because it needs to be replicated because it's on a transaction machine, is the data that you're keeping in your operational data store. Inside the warehouse archive layer and your analytical applications, there is no duplication. And I was like, wow. Said, yeah, by the way, Sybase IQ gets 80% compression, so it doesn't really matter if there is duplication, but there isn't duplication, so you don't need to worry about it. And I was like, wow, my mate who told me you guys know what it is that you're doing, you really do know what it is that you're doing. He goes, oh yeah, we know exactly what it is that we're doing. We're the best. There's nobody better. This guy sitting in this class, he goes, "There's nobody who does this better than what we do. Not that we know about." And I'm like, sounds like that's true so far. Like, I'm on day 2 of your training. What you're saying sounds true to me. He goes, "Oh yeah, we're really good at this. We have nailed this." And I'm like, okay. So, gentlemen, what I want you to understand is right from the very beginning, it was very well understood that dimensional models were intended to be used by business people, intended to be used as a lossy information store, just have the information in it, which is the most important information in the organization to apply to the most expensive problems or the most opportunistic problems within an organization, where by having this information, the amount of new profit that we could make was the most. That's where dimensional models were aimed. That was a very sharp arrow aimed at a very specific problem where dimensional models emerged, right? Dimensional models, as Ralph envisaged them way back in the early 80s, were never about archiving all the information or all the data from operational systems, because that would have been ludicrous in 1982. That would have been an extraordinarily ridiculous idea. 1982, gentlemen, a gigabyte of disk from IBM cost $100,000. You didn't archive stuff. You didn't have query databases of archived data in 1982. Even by 1991, disk was still selling at 20,000 US dollars per gigabyte. I remember in 1993 we sold our customer, the third largest insurance company in Australia, 154 gigabytes of disk, and this was considered an absolutely massive deal. 154 gigabytes, the extra 4, I don't know why they bought the extra 4, but we sold 154 gigabytes of disk, and that was a massive deal, selling that much disk in 1993. Okay? Those were the numbers we were dealing with. The idea of having a copy of your data that you could query, where there wasn't an absolute necessity of high value for it, that was ridiculous back in those days. So, Bill Enman comes along and looks at all these transaction systems being built for all these large companies and says, gee, I think as a broader theoretician, I think it would be really useful to archive all that data. Well, yeah, but how much is it going to cost? And what's the business benefit for it? And the business benefit for it was very difficult to articulate. It's like, yeah, build the data warehouse and then we'll find out something. Build the data warehouse and then we'll figure out how to make value out of it. Wasn't a very good sales pitch. Versus Metaphor saying you're spending all this millions, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising. We will help you pinpoint your advertising to maximize your return on investment. Okay, that's something that I can understand. And I used to do sales calls in Australia where I'd sit down with the directors of marketing and I'd say, look, between you and me, we both know that half your marketing dollars are wasted, don't we? And they'd nod and say, yeah, don't tell too many people that, but yeah. Right? And my response would be, what we propose to do is figure out which half of your marketing dollars is wasted and redeploy that money where it can be more profitable for your company. And they'd look at me and say, how much is that going to cost me? And I'd say $300,000 to get it in production. You can trial it and play around with it just for consulting fees, but roughly $300,000 to get that in production. And these are guys spending $50 million on advertising. It's like, I can spend $300,000 and maybe I can improve the profitability of my advertising spend. Sounds like a deal? Because we know that a lot of it's wasted because we can't understand how the effectiveness of our marketing dollar spend. I got quite a few deals like that, gentlemen. Versus you know, what you should do is archive all the information in your company, and one day somebody will come up with a question, and that archive will be really valuable. And the questions would be, well, what question are they going to come up with? What's going to be so valuable? And if you can't explain that to me, I'm not spending money with you. And by the way, this is going to cost you $1 million or more, not 300,000 like Pete's selling me, right? So that was kind of the dynamic in the 90s, gentlemen. So we knew and understood that archiving data was valuable, but articulating that value, using specific examples, well, that was difficult because we didn't have histories of specific examples. And only in 2001 did I see, how is it that we can archive data in a dimensional model and have the one modeling technique used across the operational data store, the data warehouse archive layer, and the dimensional models, saving vast amounts of money in development and support by having just one modeling technique. I found that in 2001. I didn't invent it, but I found it, and we used it, and we sold it heavily as a feature. And then, as I've said on a previous video, in 2002, we put an integer key onto those association records, and that meant that we didn't even have to remember what the data models looked like. And we could have perfectly archived data thrown into the data warehouse forever using this association method. And so by mid 2002, we had a suite of modeling techniques which were based on the dimensional models, which supported everything that Bill Inman was talking about and supported everything that Ralph Kimball was talking about, and then plus some. And I think it was like 2003, 2004, something like that. I was talking with Bill and Ralph, and I said, look, if you agree not to tell anybody, because we at Sybase are using this as a significant competitive advantage, I'll show you something that you'll be really impressed with that neither of you know about. I'll show you something that you'll be really impressed with. You just can't go public with it. You can know that it's there. You can know that we're doing it. You can even recommend us if you like. But, we're selling these things like hotcakes. And this is one of the prime features that we're selling. And they basically went, yeah, if you're telling me you can show me something that I don't know, I'm really interested, right? And, I'm the same. I say to people, if you can tell me something that I don't know, I'll be really impressed. So I said that to Bill and Ralph about 2003, 2004. So I'll show you something that you don't know, something you'll be really interested with. And I showed them those models and that idea, and they both came back and went, wow, that's archives inside a dimensional model. And I went, yeah, you both understand what that means. And they went, wow, we're impressed. And I said, yeah. It wasn't my idea, by the way. I just added the integer key at the front. I told them both I added the integer key at the front, but apart from that, wasn't my idea. And they went, that's really good. Okay, nice to know that something like this is out there, actually out there and about and able to be purchased by companies. And I said, yeah, we don't tell anybody about it. We only tell prospects about it during the sales cycle. And they go, yeah, I can understand why you don't want people pinching this, because once you see it, it's an obvious idea and it's easy to pinch. So we didn't tell people about it, and they did me the favor. They didn't tell people about it anyway. Now here we are in 2021. I went public with that information last year in 2020 because I need to improve my income. So inside a dimensional model, gentlemen, by June 2002, it was possible to archive data perfectly inside a dimensional model. Now, just as we get towards the end of this, I want to go back over Data Vault 1.0, Data Vault 2.0, right? And Dan's work, etc. So obviously, I know Dan Lindstedt. We're not friendly or chummy or anything else like that. We don't exchange emails, etc. But I've known Dan for years and years and years, since probably the mid-90s. Dan came onto the scene publicly around the mid-90s, and Dan had worked with Bill, and his primary place of building warehouses was government, US federal government. Now you have to understand that data in government is different to data in commercial enterprises. The nature of the data is different. The governmental style systems, typically there's only one of them in the country, and typically they store information and have changes to that information. They don't generally act like a transaction-based system. Okay? So governments don't have systems that look like banking systems and look like telephone billing systems and look like retail systems. Like banks, telephone companies, airlines, retailers, those companies are transaction-based companies. The driver of the business are the transactions with the consumers. That's what drives those businesses. And so you have businesses based on transactions most of the time out in the commercial world. And that those businesses based on transactions are the ones that benefit most from dimensional models, of course, because dimensional models are well suited to representing information that is captured in business transactions. Whereas in government, it's different. And in government, the government captures information about you or about some entity and tends to record then the changes to that information over time. That's what governments do a lot of. So that data looks quite different. It looks much more like the data in a life insurance company. Okay? So in a life insurance company, you have the base policy, life policy record, and then you have the policy rider records, and then you have the alterations to both the base and the riders over time, and then you just have the payment transactions. And nothing really happens because unless the person dies or has serious injury, depending on what the life insurance policy is covering, unless the person dies, there's nothing to be done apart from alterations to the policy terms and conditions. So the life insurance industry, with policies and riders and alterations to those conditions, acts much more like what you see in government departments. And I'm the first one to say those things don't sit well inside a data model, a dimensional model, because they're not transaction based. Often these things are time based, where riders will expire unless they are paid for again. So you expire a rider by not paying for it on the policy and things like that. So these things, the life insurance business does not closely match the characteristics of a dimensional model. Now the sales and marketing side does, and things like that. So you can build a dimensional model for a life insurance business quite nicely. But as I said in the story, this Steve guy was working for a life insurance company, and he could see the areas where the dimensional models a la Ralph Kimball were needed, but he could also see these areas where archival models were needed a la Bill Inman. And we'd never done both in one customer. We'd done one or the other, whichever seemed most appropriate for this customer. This life insurance company that Steve did was the first time, to my knowledge, that somebody did both. Now, Bill's company, Pinecone Systems, had been experimenting with dimensional models and had put the dimensional models into a couple of customers. Bill told me that himself, face to face, in 1994. As in saying, yeah, I know what Ralph is doing. I talked to Ralph, and we've even put in some dimensional models, and we're experimenting with that. But we think an archive is more important, right? So that I had that conversation with him when he was in Australia in 1994. If memory serves me, like that's a long time ago. Please forgive me if it was somewhere else, some other time. So that's how that came about. Now, Dan Linstead, being in the government area where the nature of the data was different, went down the path of archival data stores, because that's really important in government situations. Being able to go back and answer questions historically is important, particularly when you have inquiries into things that happened in the past. So Dan came out of that world, and he was talking about taking Bill's time variant stability analysis proposal that he put out in his book, and I think it was 1991 or 92 that he published the book Building the Data Warehouse. Dan built on those ideas and came out with the idea of Data Vault. And the name kind of implies what it is. If you are a government department and you have all this information from all these computer systems that you're running as a government department, taking that information and putting it into the data vault as an archive is something useful to do, because later on we can come along and look at, when a question comes up, we can go and look in the data vault and hopefully answer the question if we ever had that information go through our computer systems. And there is value in that. There's always been acknowledged to be value in that. So I had a look at Data Vault 1.0 and Data Vault 2.0, and I understand and know what it is that they're doing. And they're building archival data stores for the unknown future question. And that's fine. Okay, there's value in that. I don't have any argument about that. But that the Data Vault and the archival data store for the unknown future question is best suited to industry segments where the number of transactions is relatively low compared to the amount of data that you're storing. Okay? Now, if you go read through Data Vault 2.0, etc., you'll see that they talk about having the data in the data vault and the specific modeling techniques to put the data into the data vault, etc. And then you can have either A, virtual cubes over the top of the data vault to present the dimensional model to the end user such that they can use it, or if that takes too much performance, you can have you can forward data from the data vault to cubes. So what's this, gentlemen? And what happens if you put an operational data store into this mix? Well, if you have a data vault using the data vault modeling techniques, you can't use those techniques inside the operational data store, so you are likely going to use third normal form inside the operational data store. You're going to send data from the operational data store into the data vault, put it into the data vault modeling technique, and then you're going to either present virtual dimensional models out to the end user from the data vault, or you're going to physically forward data from the data vault into dimensional models. Now, why would you not use virtual dimensional models? Performance, the cost of it. Okay. So you would be still using three different modeling techniques. If you created dimensional models out on the front of a data vault, you would be using three different modeling techniques, and you would be getting replication of the transaction data, which the more transaction data there is, the larger the amount of data being replicated, right? So Data Vault, as useful as it is, specifically in areas like life insurance and government businesses, has a cost profile for building these things. And we know that because I built them. Okay? Before the days of Data Vault, I built time variant stability analysis models. Steve did, PricewaterhouseCoopers did. We had very good understanding of the cost profile of building these things because we had to bid on customers to build these things. We had to understand how much it was going to cost. And of course, when I was working for PricewaterhouseCoopers, I wasn't allowed to tell the customers about this fantastic ETL development tool that I developed to reduce the cost to the customer, because the whole point of selling consulting from PricewaterhouseCoopers was to charge a lot of money for our consulting. Productivity tools in the development process, they were not very popular around PricewaterhouseCoopers, of course. So companies have a choice with Data Vault. You have a choice of, are we going to go down the Data Vault path? And there are some areas of businesses, such as government, life insurance, where the answer to that would be this would be a better approach than using the sort of dimensional models that Pete's talking about. And I'm quite happy to sit here 1 hour into this presentation and say, yeah, it's probably not a good idea to try and apply the association archival method to government departments where they're recording things rather like an insurance company and don't have a lot of transactions. The departments that do have a lot of transactions, maybe you could use dimensional models there, but the departments that don't have a lot of transactions, you are not going to be well served using dimensional models. And the idea is, why should you be well served using dimensional models? That's not what dimensional models were intended for in the first place. The marketing department and the advertising dollar spent inside a consumer packaged goods company bears absolutely no resemblance business-wise to running welfare benefits for communities or tax reviews or stuff like that. Like, the business processes bear no resemblance. Why would the same data modeling techniques support both? Like, really? So people have a choice. You can go down the archival path in business areas like government that have low numbers of transaction volumes. That's fine, and Dan's a nice guy and I like him, and good luck to him. He's done a lot of good in the world around the area of business intelligence. Or if you never knew that it was possible to archive data properly in a dimensional model, you can go have a look at what we've released now. And remembering we only released this last year. 2 years ago in 2019, I wasn't telling people about the fact that I wasn't telling people broadly and publicly about the fact we could archive data inside a dimensional model. I was telling people about that privately and quietly. Okay? So you have a choice. And you can go to my website and you can go and look at exactly how data is archived in a dimensional model. And of course, my CTL software knows how to put data into those archives. It has a feature built into it to put data into those archives very effectively. The delta, I can literally give you the code that shows you how do you archive party records into the dimensional archive for BI4ALL. I can literally give you the code that does that. You can go and have a look at it, right? Decide for yourself whether it seems sensible. So just on an hour, that's what I wanted to cover today. I wanted to cover kind of this history and this so-called dispute between Bill and Ralph over modeling techniques, and tell you, gentlemen, it's been over since June 2002. Since June 2002, it's been, or I first saw in February 2001, but then we added the extra feature in June 2002. Since June 2002, for high transaction style businesses, it's been possible to archive data in the dimensional model and attach that archive to every transaction that touches a party, be it a vendor, customer, employee, whatever. Okay? It's been possible. So, I hope this video was interesting, this audio was interesting. I hope it told you a little bit about the background of the history of the BI models, the way that we built these things, where these things came from, why we did them this way, etc. Out into the future, where's this leading us, gentlemen? Where's this leading us? What's happening out into the future? Out into the future, we now maintain all our data models through Excel workbooks. We maintain our data models through workbooks, our tables, our indexes, all those sort of things, the RI constraints can all be maintained through workbooks, and we develop our ETL systems through workbooks, and we have a way now of developing ETL where we can map somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 fields per month in a mature environment going full out. If in your learning curve, it's going to be less. But back in the days when I was working with Sean, our standard was 1,000 fields per month. In any big company, there's some easy, medium, difficult mapping to do. We just use the number 1,000 fields per month we can map. And that was a nice round number estimate. And that's what we were doing at TalkTalk in 2009, SkyTalk in 2010, 1,000 fields per work month in the mapping exercise. We are now at between 6,000 and 8,000 fields per work month in the mapping exercise. We are now in the position where we can build a dimension table in 2 hours and a fact table in 4 hours. And so with that sort of productivity improvement, we are now in the position where we can build ETL systems for entire ERPs. Let me say that again, because this has real implications. We are now in the position where we can build ETL systems quite effectively, quite cost effectively for entire ERPs, and make the ERP the central hub of the ETL, of the data warehouse system, and we can feed other systems into that data warehouse, and we can build all that out in very short time, very cost effectively. So we can literally take all the data from an entire ERP, feed it into a custom built data warehouse for that ERP, and feed into that all the other data from the enterprise. We can do that in the space of months. And so what some of my customers are now doing is looking at all this and going, what we should do is go into the ERP BI business. We should build BI solutions for whole ERPs because we can afford to. And the other ERP BI solutions that are out there can't compete with us. Unless they switch to CTL. If they switch to CTL to build their warehouse, they can compete with us on productivity, but they don't have Pete's models to build to. So, how are they going to do that? Also, their installed accounts, how are they going to bring their installed accounts across? But that's the future, gentlemen. The future is today we're at mapping 6,000 to 8,000 fields, and of course the question is, the query is, how do we use AI to replace guys like me in that build process? How do we use AIs to figure out how to build the data warehouse and how to do the mappings? And then it will become a relatively automated process to build a data warehouse, won't it? But at 6,000 to 8,000 fields per month mappings, you can do an awful lot of data warehouse building with that sort of productivity number. And the ETL is all generated as SQL, or you can use what my customers are doing, are using the C++ CTL programs for the dimension tables and using the SQL generation for the fact tables. And that's because the C++ has some function in it that SQL hasn't been able to replicate yet. The C++ dimension maintenance programs have function in it that you can't write. You literally can't write it in SQL yet. Or if you could write it in SQL, it would be far too verbose to write it in. And why not just use the existing C++, which is very stable? That's the future, gentlemen. So if you have a data warehouse, if you're a company that has an installed data warehouse and you're using the likes of DataStage, Informatica or other tools to maintain your ETL subsystem, and you would like to reduce the costs of that, download CTL, give it a go. If you want me to give it a go for you, you'll have to pay me for my time. But your IT people will be smart enough to figure out how to use it. Now, they may not like the idea that you're going to get rid of DataStage or Informatica, but such is life. Okay? those tools have outlived their usefulness because SQL is now strong enough, powerful enough and the databases are fast enough to do your ETL pretty much in SQL, particularly effect table ETL processing. So if you are the proud owner of a data warehousing system, and you would like your ETL development and support to be faster, cheaper, better, you can get CTL for free today. Give it to your tech people and say, check this out, gentlemen. And if they won't check it out, we at IBI can offer you people who will replace your ETL subsystems and support them ongoingly. So basically, what I'm saying to you is, if your guys won't reduce the cost of ETL support because they're wedded to DataStage Informatica or whatever the tool that is that they like, and they're not willing to move, you can always replace them. Okay? They either get with the program or leave, go somewhere else, because we are able to, with the speed of the internet and reliability of the internet today, I am able to give you people in my resellers trained by me who will look after your data warehouses 24/7 anywhere in the world and make sure they keep running using CTL. In fact, if you want to continue to use DataStage and Informatica, we can support that too, but we're going to charge you more, right? If you want to reduce the cost of your ETL support and processing, you can migrate across to CTL. You can do it yourself for free from us using the software, or if you don't want to do it yourself, or your guys don't want to do it because they're wedded to those tools, we can do it for you. Okay, that's kind of the sales pitch there. In terms of models, if you want to figure out and over time perhaps migrate to a suite of models that is able to archive data inside a dimensional model so you don't have multiple modeling techniques inside your organization, we're happy to do that for you. The kind of top level constraint you would be looking at is you should be a high transaction volume business. And the models we have out of the box are telco. We have a base model for retailers, but telco, retail, web, media are the ones that we have that are available today. We can build other ones, and what we're spending most of our time on is looking at building BI solutions for whole ERPs. We may build some other models. We have all this experience in all these other industries, me like life insurance, etc. We could build models for these other things, but right now there's not many people buying models. If in the future, you gentlemen listening to this, say you work for a telco, work for a retailer, these sort of things, a website that sells things, if people start buying these models and start implementing these models, and we start expanding these models, then we go, okay, well, maybe we introduce some more models. Maybe. But today, we're not selling many of these. Don't know why. If I was you guys out there, I'd be buying these and implementing them. Just as I wrap up, I'm reminded of a story. There's a telephone company in the UK, Virgin Media. They're owned by Richard Branson. It's a telephone company, telephone, web, that sort of thing. And back in 2006, they were called 2006, 2007, can't remember. They were called NTL. They were NTL Telco back then. And I think 2007. You correct me if I'm wrong. It's a long time ago. So NTL were considering, we were selling our new models as they were at the time to TalkTalk, and NTL got word from TalkTalk that we had a set of telco models, and NTL invited us in to compete against Accenture Consulting, basically. So NTL had looked at the Netezza machine and decided the Netezza machine looked really promising for telco data warehousing. They talked to TalkTalk about the Netezza machine. TalkTalk, Brian Ganley gave them a big rap, And so NTL were looking into that, and Brian or somebody from TalkTalk told them about us. Now we went in and gave them the pitch, and it was 6-all. Accenture got 6 votes, we got 6 votes, and eventually NTL said, Accenture versus Sean and Pete, we're going to go with Accenture, going to go with the safe option, right? Accenture Consulting was seen as a safe option. And Accenture had told NTL, what you need is you need to start with a blank sheet of paper because you're such a different telephone company. You couldn't possibly use a standardized telco model and extend it just for you. We have to build one for you from scratch, is how that conversation went. So we lost the deal. Now eventually we got the deal with TalkTalk, and we did the implementation with TalkTalk, and in 2009 Netezza held a user conference in London for all the Netezza installed accounts, and we, Sean Kelly and Brian Ganley, got a breakout session, and we had about 30 or 40 people in our breakout session to talk about the TalkTalk Netezza data warehouse project that we just finished before this conference. And so Sean and Brian talked about the numbers, and I was sitting in the audience, and the numbers were that we were able to do the entire mapping process of 4,000 fields took about 4 months. And the whole project took just over 6 months because there's startup time and then there's going through the testing process and all the rest of it. So there was a month startup time, and there was, I think, 2 months through the testing, implementation into production process. Something like those numbers. And so Brian and Sean talked about this. This guy put up his hand and said, "Excuse me, but I believe you're saying that you mapped approximately 1,000 fields per month during the mapping phase of the project." And he said, "Yeah, that's our standard number, 1,000 fields per month. Doesn't really matter what the data is. If you're a telco, it's about 1,000 fields per month." This guy's like, "That's astonishing." So at the end of the session, this guy comes forward to Sean and Brian, and I come and join them at the front of the room. And this guy says, the numbers that you're talking about for the development process are astonishing and certainly not in line with our experience. And Sean says, "Well, who are you?" Because we didn't know who he was. "Who are you? Who do you work for?" He goes, "Well, I worked for NTL as they were at the time." He goes, "Oh, yeah, you guys went with Accenture. How's that going?" And he didn't know us. He wasn't there when we were pitching to them for the project. But Sean, basically said, "Oh yeah, you work for Accenture. Oh, okay. Yeah, how are you guys going?" He said, "Well, we've been at it for 2 years. We haven't got anything in production yet." And Sean and Brian just laughed. And Sean said, "You do know that we pitched for that business a couple of years ago, and we lost. The vote was 6-all, and we lost to Accenture. And you guys went with Accenture because they were the safe option. Do you know that happened?" And the guy went, no idea. I joined the project after that period, obviously. And Sean said, yeah, we pitched for it, and you guys decided that you didn't want us. And here we are. We did the TalkTalk job instead. We implemented the whole thing in about 7 months, and you guys are still at it, you're telling me. And he goes, "Yeah, we're still at it. We haven't got anything in production yet." And he said, "Well, tell you what, when you would like to get moving on your project, give us a call, and we'll come and do your project. But please be aware, you're going to pay full ticket prices." And he goes, "Well, why would you say we'll pay full ticket prices?" He said, "You got enough money to pay Accenture for 2 years for doing nothing useful. You're going to pay us properly." And we all laughed, and he said, "Yeah, I guess I walked into that one, didn't I?" So yes, gentlemen, Accenture, NTL bought the Accenture project, and the Accenture project was going to be a custom build of exactly what it is that you need, because you're such a radically different telephone company to every other telephone company. You need us, Accenture, to build you a custom model. And 2 years later, they still hadn't gotten anything into production, according to this gentleman who was there, right? And so that's kind of the difference. If you are in that kind of business, you should be having a look at these models and deciding whether you want to either migrate to them. Just so you know, gentlemen, I understand, most large companies already have installed data warehouses. Most large companies. Mostly we're selling these models to smaller companies that don't have installed data warehouses. Now, if you are a large company with an installed data warehouse and you want to move off the models that you have, you can go through and have a look at these models, and we can talk about how that can be done, right? But if you have a large installed data warehouse now and you just don't like the cost of your ETL support, that's where you can have CTL for free. So that's kind of the history of it all, gentlemen. We are now at the point where the BI4ALL models, I've been working with them for 20 years. I've come up with precisely one new idea in 20 years. I think it would be really interesting to work on some projects and actually have another idea come up. But if the models have been so stable that I haven't been able to come up with a new idea for a modeling technique in 20 years, then that's probably pretty stable. All right? So that's what I wanted to say. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you sat back, relaxed, had a cup of coffee or whatever. That's where we're up to. We're now up to the position of being able to build data warehouses at the rate of 6,000 to 8,000 fields mapped per work month across to a suite of well-proven models, and that opens up the whole area of building data warehouses for ERPs in a viable time frame and a reasonable budget. Okay? So with that, I think I shall finish there. With that, I shall say thank you very much for listening, and bye for now.